Chapter 1 of The Beginning Was the End by Oscar Kiss Maerth. Translated from German by Judith Hayward. Man came into being through cannibalism. Intelligence can be eaten. Prager Publishers, New York, Washington. Chapter 1 of Oscar Kiss Maerth's The Beginning Was the End. Chapter 1 The Newcomer Without a Memory. Man is a newcomer on the earth. He can remember neither the hour of his birth nor his origin. For a long time he fancied himself the center of the world, as he imagined it, and by God's will its appointed master. He placed himself at the apex of an imaginary self-constructed pyramid, and he has had to climb down from it step by step in the course of the last 2,000 years. He stands at present on the lowest step, but he must now retreat even from there. He must learn the truth concerning his origin and himself. No man can remember the hour of his birth, not because he has forgotten it. He has never consciously experienced it. Birth is a passage to a new consciousness, and in the course of it, what has been known before sinks into the subconscious. Mankind as a species once had an hour of birth too, when it left its animal condition and the process of human development was completed. This was a decisive passage to a new consciousness. At that time, something extraordinary happened in the human brain. Knowledge of the past was submerged in the subconscious, and simultaneously, a new consciousness began. On account of this occurrence, and on account of it alone, the human species, in spite of its exceptionally high intelligence, is unable to remember either its origin or its earlier existence. Only since that time has man been confronted by the tormenting questions. Where do we come from? What are we? Why are we? Where are we going? No one was able to answer him, for the witnesses of his birth, the animals and plants, were silent. His surroundings held their peace, curious and uncertain. He began to answer these questions himself. He established that he was superior to his brothers, the animals, and that he surpassed them by reason of his intelligence and cunning. He recognized that when he was able to shape matter according to his own ideas and for his own ends, he wandered over this earth and found no end to it. He looked at the sun, the moon, and the stars, and these seemed to move around him. This led him to an egocentric and self-laudatory hypothesis concerning himself and the world. God alone stood above him. For man, the world consisted of the earth, which was flat and firmly anchored. The sun and all the stars circled round the earth. He, man, lived on the middle of this flat earth and was the crowning achievement of creation. Because the world for him was only the earth. God had created him with his own hands, and he was the favorite of this God. Indeed, he was God's representative on earth. Only through man was meaning given to the creation of the world. Indeed, God had made man in his image. So if man wanted to see how God appeared, he need only look in a mirror. His mission was divine. Only he and no other living being had a soul. He alone was called to know God, to recognize him, to praise him. He was to rule on earth and preserve and effect divine justice and harmony. He was to improve all God's works on earth. More, to finish God's uncompleted work through his own progress. God had given him intelligence, in a degree, for that purpose. Strengthened and encouraged by this self-formed theory, he placed himself at the apex of his imaginary pyramid, and from there he sang his own praises. Thus self-deceived, he set about his divine special mission. He wanted to govern the world, but soon became aware that he could not govern himself. This gave his consciousness no rest. This gave his conscience no rest. He felt that he was deluding himself with this theory, for it was too attractive. Reality, however, was quite different. He saw that animals and plants lived harmoniously in the framework of a divine order, which he was unable to do, and felt that in himself something was lacking, which was necessary for his happiness on earth. Certainly in and satisfaction with himself, and harmony and peace with his fellow men and the world around him. He searched in desperation for the meaning of this existence, and could find none. But he never openly admitted this, for such an admission would have stamped him as an imperfect being. With ever-increasing doubt in his heart, he remained at the apex of this imagined pyramid. Then, 2,000 years ago, his peace of mind was deeply shaken. A Greek maintained that the earth was not a flat disk, but a sphere. This disturbed man's notion that he was placed at the center of the earth, for there is no center on the surface of a sphere. He was forced to take a hesitant step down from his pyramid and consoled himself with all that remained of his imaginary world. But the earth was still the very world for him. The sun, the moon, and the stars circled round him, and he was still God's favorite creature, created by God himself with his own hands, so that he could delight in him. He was still the cleverest being in the world, and the only one to have been given his soul by God. Then, 400 years ago, man had to sustain a further shock. It was established that it is not the sun that circles round the earth, but the earth that circles round the sun. The man who demonstrated this also discovered that many other planets, some even larger than the Earth, circle round the sun. This was bitter news. Man's special place in the universe took on a still paler hue. Reluctantly, he climbed a further step down from his pyramid and consoled himself a second time with the remains of his idle conception concerning himself and his world. Only a few decades later, more bad tidings came to light. A Christian monk had the courage to affirm that there are millions of much larger suns, with thousands of millions of planets circling around them, many of which are 1,000 times larger than the Earth. This was too much for man. He felt deeply insulted and persuaded himself that God was insulted by such a theory too. A holy tribunal, which stood under the direct patronage of God, therefore condemned the scholar to death and had him burnt alive. This was God's authority reestablished. I'm sorry, that should have read, a holy tribunal which stood under the direct patronage of God, therefore condemned the scholar to death and had him burnt alive. Thus was God's authority reestablished. But almost before the smoke from the fire at the stake had dispersed, man, humiliated and shaken, was forced to take one further step down. For proof of the truth proclaimed by the scholar they had burnt was overwhelming. So there were indeed millions of suns and thousands of millions of planets. Man consoled himself again with what remained of his theories. He was still crowning achievement and creation and the only being with a soul. God had created him so that creation might have a meaning. For God wanted to have someone who could value him so that he might step forth from his solitary and anonymous position. The creature newly came to earth without a memory was still convinced that without him the world would be incomplete and God himself unhappy. It was only about 500 years ago, when trading seafarers were visiting distant peoples and civilizations more frequently and hearing different myths and theories concerning the origin of man, that people became more critical of their own. For according to different civilizations, man was said to have been made from earth, from water, from the scent of flowers, from fire and lightning, and even from a drop of heaven itself. In India, one legend is handed down among many, according to which man once lived under the earth, and only at a later stage caught hold of the tails of the cows as they grazed and was pulled up by them. Other peoples believed man to be a direct descendant of unions between the gods. This imaginative genealogical tree put man in a thoughtful mood There could not possibly be so many different truths concerning his descent. He began to investigate and to dig. He found the 10,000-year-old remains of the bones of his forebears. But these were no different from his own. He also found much older ones, and to his astonishment, he had to accept that the older these were, the less their resemblance to his own bones. What disturbed him still more was the circumstance that the older skeletons discovered were, the more marked their resemblance to those of the great apes. Fossils of bones which were 700,000 years old faced those carrying out research with the question, should these be classified as human remains or ape remains? For both descriptions, ape-man and man-ape, are equally true. Then barely 150 years ago, scholars proved that man was no more created in his final form at the wave of a hand than were other living creatures. He is the result of evolution. They also established that man's forebears were man-like, so-called hominid apes, whose near connections, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, are still alive today. What is found and discovered also made it clear that the development from animal to man took place in several hundred thousands of years. But this must be considered singularly rapid and unique. There are no parallels in biology for such development. This bitter news oppressed man still further, when so much had already been whittled away from his special position in the universe. His divine origin and his divine mission were even more open to question. Faced with these proofs, man had no but to accept his descent from a hairy option. Faced with these proofs, man had no option but to accept his descent from a hairy animal. But he scrupulously avoided describing his ancestors as apes. He named them ape-like creatures, for man, though deposed from his throne, does not want his ancestors to bear the same name as those hairy creatures he laughs at in zoos. He climbed down yet one more step from his once so high pyramid. Now he stands on the lowest step and consoles himself with the remaining scraps of his once splendid conceptions concerning himself and his imagined world. But he is beginning to worry about his soul. He puzzles about whether he acquired it when he was still an animal, or not until later, when he was killing his fellow man with a stone axe. How can an animal have a soul? Yet how can God reward man killing man by giving him a soul? Or might it perhaps be that animals have souls too? This would be the worst possible explanation, for that would leave nothing at all of man's special position and divine mission on earth. So he passes over this in deep silence. But man does not give in. He now tries to explain his origin and subsequent descent by means of the will of God, or at least of an order created by God. He does admit certainly that he is the outcome of development from animal to man. But he says, too, that this circumstance does not rule out his special divine mission. For evolution itself is a process brought about by God or by nature, and he can still have been chosen by God to carry out some special divine task. Spurred on by this notion, he devotes himself now to his new problem. By hook or by crook, he means to prove that he is the product of natural evolution. Feverishly, he seeks to prove this, and when he comes up against phenomena indicating the contrary, he turns them around until such time as they fit in with the picture he wishes have already prepared. His wishes have already prepared. He explains everything he does or does not do, and all the physical and spiritual attributes he possesses or does not possess, so as to produce a natural development. And what is more, he explains them as representing progress in relation to animals, even when he is secretly ashamed of his deeds and shortcomings. He clings desperately to his new theory. For now, he's already standing on the lowest step of his once so high and fantastic pyramid. There below, at his feet, are the animals, which were surely created to serve him. At all costs, he means to avoid moving down to the ground. He, the image of God. But he has no option but to climb down from the last step and place himself on the firm ground of reality. The truth concerning man's beginnings and the consequences of this truth will run round the earth, causing profound shock. All former ideas concerning human life, human goals, and human progress will waver and collapse. The human species stands at the opening of a new epoch, which is at the same time its last epoch, for it is heading inevitably towards the final phase of its existence. Man is not the outcome of either natural or healthy development. He did not come into being in the framework of the universal laws of cosmic order. Man himself, against all the rules of natural evolution and against the order of nature, made himself by manipulating his own brain. The road from ape to man was made up of a chain of criminal acts, contrary to the laws of nature. Man has become the lunatic genius of the universe, whose diseased mind, with its absurd objectives, is necessarily and inevitably becoming his doom. Man still esteems himself and the progress which he began some tens of thousands of years ago, and which he calls progress. He does not know that this progress is the product of his disturbed mind, with which he is accelerating his inevitable destruction. He draws comfort in the sufferings he has brought upon himself from his supposed progress. From it, he expects the happiness he has not found. But deep in his soul, he feels more and more clearly that he is the victim of self-deception. And a presentiment tells him that He is facing fateful times, which he cannot grasp and cannot control. In the quiet before the approaching storm, he holds his breath. He listens fearfully to the distant rumbling of thunder, and hopes as he listens that his senses are deceiving him. They are not deceiving him. Chapter 2: The Collapse of a Theory. Man perceived that his forebears were hominid apes. He tries to explain his formulation on the basis of the theory of natural evolution. But human development is in contradiction to cosmic order. It was set in motion by man's own sinful interference and produced physical defects dangerous to his existence, and an oversized, sick brain, which made his self-destruction appear to be progress. Proof that man is descended from the ape, or, as man prefers to put it, from an ape-like creature, is more than sufficient. Especially in the last 2 decades. So many fossils of the bones of early man have been found that an unbroken chain can be established going back more than 1 million years. The older these remains are, the more the appearance of man gives way to the form of an ape. Reliable research showed that the progress of human development began over 1 million years ago. And in any case, not later than 700,000 years ago. Whenever human development began, it is a fact that 400,000 years ago, man was already very like he is today in outward appearance. That means that in biological terms, this unique development from ape to man took place in an exceptionally short time. And no satisfactory explanation for this has yet been given. More important than the question when human development began are the questions why and how this process took place. A further question is, where are the fossilized bones of these apes from which man later developed? It is true that a fair number of ape remains have been found in which the process of human development can already be recognized, but no remains have been found of any apes of which man can say with certainty that these are the forebears of later man. The majority of bone fossils belonging to creatures already manifesting human traits and producing tools were found in Southeast Asia, principally in the Olduvai Gorge. Later on, they found in the same place fossils of the same breeds, but with the skulls, bone structure, and jaws and teeth showing small divergencies. The fossils of apes, which had not yet started on the process of human development, that is to say, they did not use tools. With seeming logic, it was concluded that these apes had lived some hundreds of thousands of years earlier, and that they were the primitive ancestors of the tool-producing ape man. Great was the astonishment when it had to be admitted in the face of an unequivocal proof that both the tool-making creatures and their non-tool-producing supposed ancestors lived not only in the same place, but at the same time. This flatly contradicts the theory of natural evolution, for if for some reason a breed of ape became embarked upon a process of development leading toward man, then All members of that breed who lived in at the same time in the same geographical place would have to undergo the same process. It is not consistent with natural evolution that a section of the breed should suddenly begin a rocket-like ascent toward human development, become clever, and produce tools, while the remaining section, living at the same time in the same place, remains ape and does no more than look on in astonishment. Strange to tell, the apes which did not produce tools disappeared without trace, while the others continued to further their development. Did the former die out because they were not clever enough to keep themselves alive? Does that mean you have to become human to avoid extinction? Then how is it that other breeds of ape, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans among them, have not become extinct? Then there were other similar complications, which made the situation even more confusing. In Southeast Asia, the fossilized bones of another breed of ape have been found, especially on the island of Java. And this breed also shows the characteristics of human development, and they too produce tools. Here too remains a type of ape very similar to the tool-producing apes were found. Here too remains of a type of ape very similar to the tool-producing ape were found. They produced no tools, so that it was supposed here also that these were the forebears of the tool-making ape. But it was not shown in this case as well that both the tool-producing and ape men and their supposed forebears had lived at the same time and in the same place. Here too, those as yet unable to produce tools disappeared without trace in a surprisingly short space of time. In other words, the riddle confronting people in Africa was repeated in Southeast Asia. And what is even stranger, the African and Javanese hominids were not of the same breed. And between the two groups, there is the Indian Ocean, which extends many thousands of miles. Was it to be taken that the wonder whereby man came into being, the causes for which have not been explained up to now, took place twice at the same time and at two widely separated points on the Earth's surface, and even among two breeds of ape which were not related to one another. How could it be that both these had so different breeds? How could it be that both these so different breeds developed into Homo sapiens independently of each other, and yet along parallel lines and in the same direction? And above all, how could it be that in both areas, both breeds of hominid ape were divided into two groups inhabiting the same territory, with one half still living unequivocally as apes, while the other had already set out on the path leading to human development and were produced. Scholars cannot explain these strange phenomena because all this is inconsistent with natural development, which they want to prove at all costs, to keep quiet about it. I'm sorry. Because all this is inconsistent with natural development, which they want to prove at all costs, they keep quiet about it. Against this scrupulously exact measurements of bones and teeth are carried out, and the tiniest details are gone into with the greatest enthusiasm. But the decisive phenomena were always left out of account if they were not in accordance with natural development and did not therefore fit into the prefabricated concept. The most decisive question concerning development from ape to man is, what were the causes which set the process of human development in motion, and why did these not operate on all other anthropoid great apes living at the same time in the same territories as the ape forebears of man? The evolutionary history of all breeds of hominid ape is known to us through finds going back about 20 million years. We know that they were very similar in form and in their way of life and developed slowly in the course of millions of years within the framework of natural evolution, without any one of these breeds making dramatic progress. Excuse me. Apart from that, we also know that about 1 million years ago, all breeds of hominid ape had roughly the same skull capacity, about 400 to 500 cubic centimeters. There was no super race among them with special abilities. The intelligence level of all of them was approximately the same, and was sufficient to allow them to fulfill the conditions basic to continued healthy existence. All hominid apes still in existence today, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, have remained at nearly the same stage of development as 1 million years ago. They altered within the bounds of natural development, just as slowly as they had in the preceding 20 million years. Over 1 million years, the capacity of their skulls grew by only about 5%, and their intelligence too presumably rose only proportionately. There was only one unexplained exception. 1 million years ago, one type of hominid ape, the identity of which has not yet been ascertained, started on a steep upward climb. The brain and the intelligence of these apes grew with a speed which is unique and unparalleled in the whole history of nature. While the brain of this breed grew from about 400 cubic centimeters to an average of 1,400 cubic centimeters, i.e. by 350%. over the last million years. Intelligence and memory increased 100-fold, or even 1,000-fold. And this enormous difference between brain growth and increase in intelligence is also an occurrence unique in nature and contrary to all rules governing natural evolution. This is rightly regarded as a puzzling phenomenon of nature, and understandably, man tries to explain this marvel which befell none other than himself. Equally understandably, he tries to present this development as natural. If he succeeds, then he can explain not only his beginnings, but also his actions and goals and being in accordance with nature, i.e., at one with divine order. He could, by the same token, put an end to his growing doubts concerning the rightness of his own endeavors, which he calls progress. Even scholars and scientists try at all costs to present this singular phenomenon as a natural development, acting therein more under pressure from the subconscious than consciously speculating without preconception. This tendency is supported by the church's theologians. They are trying desperately to fuse the theory of natural evolution from ape to man with religious dogmas in such a way as to leave untouched a divine will, and with it a special place for man. Scholars and churches are, moreover, supported in their efforts by so-called officialdom, and can proclaim the most utter nonsense without contradiction, as long as their pearls of wisdom, spiced with incomprehensible foreign words, sound scientific and argue in favor of natural evolution. Under these influences, the commonly accepted theory concerning the origin of man, which is as popular as it is naive, came into being. According to this, the forebears of man were hominid apes. Excuse me. According to this, the forebears of man were hominid apes. They lived in the forest where their closest relatives, anthropoid apes, still in existence today, lived and still do live. Through an alteration in climate, the forest disappeared and turned into prairie. In this new environment, our ancestors were exposed to many new dangers which they were unable to cope with. Animals of prey lurked in the tall grass, but more important still, their daily food was concealed by the upsurge of grass. This circumstance compelled them to get up on their hind legs and walk upright. Thus, they could see their enemies better and find their food more easily in the grasslands. And they were able to run faster like this too, if they were being chased by wild animals, or if they themselves were hunting animals. Only after they had learnt to walk and stand on their hind legs did their hands become free. This allowed them to take things in their hands and examine and observe them, and so manipulate them. They acquired the ability to think abstractly and began to shape things to serve their purposes. Thus, they made the first primitive tools and weapons, and so became superior to the animals. They became hunters and were able to feed better and use animal skins to clothe themselves. The use of weapons and tools gave them further ideas and inspirations and increased their thinking capacity. And they were able to produce increasingly complicated objects. Along with their intelligence, their feeling of social duty grew and caused the gradual formation of the closed family. They were continually forced, pardon me, they were continually forced to solve new problems by the consistently changing and rising demands which were being created at any given time by their improved way of life. This again furthered the intelligence and led to new inventions. This process has supposedly run its course as a short chain of reaction, which is the stuff of real progress. Added to this, there were the usual evolutionary factors, such as natural selection and adaptation to the demands of the environment. And they were continually making man cleverer and healthier, more morally responsible and better. This so scientifically and subtly reasoned process was supposed to show that an ape turned into Homo sapiens, a mentally and physically healthy creature, highly developed morally. Homo sapiens, who can annihilate his fellow men with atom bombs and shots at heavenly bodies with rockets. Shoots at heavenly bodies with rockets. This theory is a collection of contradictions which it is easier to refute than to invent. It is certainly simpler to believe that God, who suddenly conjured up the universe and all other living creatures by one simple command, had to knead man out of the earth with his own hands because his outstanding skills had already been exhausted. It is certain that man's ape forebears lived in the forest. Not alone, however, but with all similar anthropoid apes, which still live there today. Yeah! Ha ha! If the forest disappeared because of the climate, then it did not disappear only for those apes which were later to become man, but for all the others too. But then all apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans too, would find themselves on grassy plains. If one breed of ape was driven by fear of wild animals, and in order to find more food easily, to get up on its hind legs, why did the other apes not get on their hind legs too? For the same reasons. Was only one single breed so fearful or so clever? If walking upright was a means of movement crucial to continued existence and the preservation of life, and it was not acquired by the other apes, why were these not exterminated by wild animals? Why did they not die of hunger, as their food, too, was presumably hidden by the tall grass? And what kind of grass is it that these scientists have planted here? Scientists. Grass which was exactly at the eye level of a hominid ape standing upright. Hominid apes varied from over 3 feet to over 5 feet in height. This ideal grass would then have to match the eye level, whatever it happened to be, as there would otherwise have been no sense in walking upright. Anyone who has ever seen a prairie knows that such a miracle prairie exists only in the imagination of some scholars. According to this theory, moreover, all forests must have dried up, as otherwise the apes would have retreated into the remaining forest land, and the theory of natural evolution could have been taken no further. In fact, during the last million years, there have been several alternations between rainy and dry periods, but never did all forests dry up. Even in the driest period, there was more forest land on the earth than grassland, and all apes would have been able to withdraw to the remaining forests to pursue their accustomed way of life there. Why did all other great apes do this? But for those from which man is said to have later developed? Did one breed of ape prefer to live on barren grassland during the alleged dry period, so that they might feed there among increased dangers? Or was it that the future Homo sapiens was not clever enough to withdraw into the remaining forests? Was then stupidity itself the point of departure for human development? Or has life on grassland advantages which attracted one breed of ape onto the prairies? Why then did other great apes not profit from them? Or did dangers suddenly arise in the forest which caused some apes to flee from it because they would not have been able to survive otherwise? How then did the other apes, which did not give up living in the forest, remain in existence? Many scholars affirm, too, that man was able to run faster because he went upright. Those who maintain that should be pursued sometime by an angry gorilla. They would have to rewrite their books on the basis of their experiences. And they keep quiet about the fact that man, in walking upright, lost his ability to climb trees. If he learned how to walk upright because he was afraid of wild animals, then he acquired a wrong skill and unlearned one which he needed badly. For today, he still laboriously climbs a tree when confronted with a wild boar, a rhinoceros, or a lion. And he would give a lot to be able to do so better and more quickly. If he lost this ability at the very time he most needed it, then that is not natural development or progress, but a loss. But even this loss had to be explained as progress, so that the theory of natural evolution fits. Right from the very start, the official theory of evolution is completely untenable. For this theory, based on wishful thinking, scholars had to invent an ideal dry period and miracle grasslands. They had also to design an ape which did not find its way to the remaining forests and needed to find a stone in the tall grass so that it could, in spite of its vegetarian way of life, kill a zebra with an axe it made out of it. By a monstrous feat of imagination, they also succeeded in sending all apes, which were destined to remain apes, into the woods. And what connection is there supposed to be between free hands and increased intelligence? We know that hominid apes were predominantly forest animals and that they all, including man's forebears, had hands with which they could grasp and manipulate things. We know, too, that they spent at least 70% of their time in a sitting position, just as they do today. And when they did, they were free to use their hands. No single ape needed to stand up on its hind legs to be able to pick up objects in its hands. Quite the opposite. When apes stand up, they generally have to support themselves with their arms and are unable to hold anything in their hands. We know too that apes are curious animals and pick up and look at many objects, almost always in a sitting position. Their manual dexterity is so great that they can even catch fleas and kill them. But if they possessed the necessary intelligence, they could all become watchmakers. You do not need to go out to a university to learn this. You need only to visit a zoo for an hour. It costs less too. In spite of these completely free and dexterous hands, not a single breed of ape had been stimulated in the course of the previous 20 million years to produce even the most primitive tool. So if free hands were supposed to cause cleverness and lead to tool production, why did this possibility lie dormant in all breeds of ape for 20 million years? And why is it still dormant in the present day great apes, even though they have free hands? Why should this effect of having free hands have come into play only about 1 million years ago, and only in the case of one single apes as well? 1 million years ago, they had just as big a brain as the forebears of man then possessed. I must have ate something really yesterday. Don't try that at home. That's my own special. Why should this effect of having free hands have come into play only about 1 million years ago, and only in the case of one single breed which later developed into man? Why not among the other great apes as well? 1 million years ago, they had just as big a brain as the forebears of man then possessed. Why did they not at least copy what they saw their relations doing? Is it perhaps because free hands alone are not sufficient for the acquisition of special thinking ability? It is also necessary to walk upright. No, that will not do either. If an ape or a man has to carry out any mental work using a concentrated thought process, he tries, if possible, to do this in a sitting position because concentrated thought is considerably easier than when walking or standing. For both activities use energy, and this curtails the energy supply of the body and of the brain too, and this impedes thought. Most of man's ideas, especially the more important among them, came into being while he was sitting or lying down. Gibbons are also members of the hominid ape species. They sit a great deal. And what is more, when they walk in an upright position with their hands completely free. And yet, their intellectual abilities have progressed no further than those of the gorilla, which has to support himself when walking with its clenched hand. Quite the contrary. They were and remain on the lowest level of intelligence found among the anthropoid apes. Hence it follows that having free hands, walking upright, even the two together do not lead to an increase in intelligence. Any such claim is a complete. What do the scholars say about hunting and eating meat? All hominid apes were and are basically vegetarian. A few types of ape, mostly non-anthropoid, occasionally eat worms, mice, and other small animals. Man's forebears were vegetarian too, and became carnivores only in the course of the process of human development. This happened about 1 million years ago. And what is more, it happened overnight, so to speak, without a long transitional period. Science regards this as a natural development, and flesh eating is supposed to have been a sign of increased intelligence and even progress, because man was able, with meat, to have a lighter and better diet. Wolves and wild cats give thanks for this compliment, as they were already carnivorous many millions of years earlier. What is supposed to be meant by saying that the vegetarian half-man or half-ape, by going over to eating meat, could have a better diet? Perhaps he was underfed before, but then on the same diet, all other apes are not, and still are not right up to the present day, though they remained vegetarians. Why did they not die out a long time ago? Why are they 100 times healthier than any race of men? Unless they are living in a zoo. Or perhaps all animals that live as vegetarians are eating the wrong food simply because they are not intelligent enough to start eating meat. Does higher intelligence perforce bring flesh eating in its train? What level of intelligence would animals have to reach in the course of natural development for this to happen? When will cows start to bite? And when will elephants start eating meat? And why did it suddenly become easier for man's ancestors to feed themselves on meat? Since when has it been easier to kill a gazelle or a bison than to pick a piece of fruit from a tree? It is quite certain that all vegetarian breeds of animal were always able to solve their feeding problems without having to turn to beasts of prey. Were man's ancestors not clever enough to do this? Then the changeover to flesh eating resulted not from cleverness but from stupidity. How is it then that the very dullest apes have become men? Yes, how is it then that the very dullest apes have become men? Why then is the changeover to flesh eating said to have been a sign of higher intelligence? There were never compelling reasons for a breed of herbivorous apes to change over to being carnivorous. As some scientists maintain, on this earth, the supply of plants has always been greater than the supply of animals, and there have always been more herbivorous animals on the earth than carnivorous ones. If it were otherwise, there would certainly have been no animals left on earth long ago. Today, the earth has a population of 3,000 million people. And even they could still follow a completely vegetarian diet, although there's much less vegetarian left nowadays than in earlier times. I'm sorry, there's much less vegetation left nowadays than in earlier times. Several hundreds of millions of people do still today live as vegetarians. Not, however, because they are not intelligent enough or can find no meat, but because they have recognized a vegetarian diet as man's original one, which is in many ways beneficial. The changeover from eating plants to eating animals took place at the earliest stage of man's development, and in a very short time, overnight, so to speak. This is an absolutely unnatural occurrence. It can have nothing to do either with natural evolution or with increased intelligence. All the theories mentioned are riddled with contradictions, and under the cloak of a dubious specialist language, they were offered for acceptance to a public that hungers for confirmation of man's divine mission, which it increasingly doubts. If previously current theories are not correct, what is the truth? If instead of always looking for points of resemblance between ape and man, researchers had paid more attention to the most striking differences between them, they would probably have got further. Instead of this, they were always pleased when they found something more which men and apes have in common. The most revealing physical and mental differences are these. Anthropoid apes have a thick coat of hair, while man lost his in the process of turning into man. He was forced by this to use artificial clothing as a substitute, because otherwise he would have become extinct. Female mammals, including anthropoid apes, are so made that their time of ovulation and fertility can be recognized. During this estrus period, the female sex organ is discolored and enlarged and secretes a fluid which gives off a scent. The male animal mates with the female only when excited by these signs. The female ancestors of man also possessed these sex signs. They were lost, however, during the process of human development. The human male and female can become sexually excited and have intercourse even when the signs mentioned above are not present. Anthropoid apes were and are sufficiently intelligent to carry out all tasks necessary for continued existence. Man's ape forebears, too, possessed sufficient intelligence for this. Yet, man's intelligence has increased enormously in the last million years, although man's forebears were no more presented with new tasks by nature than any other breed of ape. The vast increase in intelligence of this species occurred, therefore, without reason, in contradiction to what is natural, and without being necessary for healthy continued existence. On the contrary, it was the cause of disharmony between man's physical and mental needs and aspirations, and made him lose his natural equilibrium between mind and body. This is not a development tending towards perfection. It does not lead to a state of happiness and therefore cannot be in harmony with cosmic order. No one disputes the fact that man's ancestors had a coat of hair. Before birth, every human embryo is covered with hair, which disappears either before or shortly after birth. What is left after that is a thin, degenerate growth, incapable of fulfilling the functions of a full coat of hair. In a few exceptional cases, human beings do have a good thick coating, good thick covering of hair, all over all or part of the body, which does not disappear. A reappearance of ancestral characteristics which have disappeared in the course of evolution is called atavism, or a throwback. In this case, that avatism is the surest proof that man's forebears were hairy animals. What functions has a coat of hair? It protects against cold and also against the strong rays of the sun and against heat. It helps to maintain the body temperature at approximately 36 degrees Celsius or centigrade. For energy is consumed both in generating warmth and in cooling down. The coat of hair isolates the body from the outside world and ensures that it is not exposed to extreme variations of temperature. This preserves energy, which can then be used for other physiological functions and to fight bacteria, which cause illness.
This is one of the reasons why animals are more resistant to illness than man. If a man goes into a drought with a naked, sweating body, he becomes ill, and his doctor calls this illness a cold. I'm sorry, a draft. If a man goes into a draft with a naked, sweating body, he becomes ill. His doctor calls this illness a cold. When this happens, the body has expended too much energy in a short period of time in replacing the lost heat. The supply of energy thus depleted is not sufficient to stand up to the bacteria in the body, and these bacteria make man ill, not cold. A naked man can, however, become ill in exactly the same way if he exposes himself too long to the rays of a strong sun. His body in this case will expend too much energy, reducing the high temperature outside, and here again, there is the danger that bacteria might attack his inside organs. Body hair, moreover, allows the moisture secreted by the pores of the skin to evaporate only at a slow rate. Quick evaporation would lead to rapid cooling down. The body, in turn, would suddenly have to expend too much energy in generating warmth, and the depleted supply of energy would not be sufficient to carry out other physiological functions. The skin of a human being secretes between 2 and 8 pints of fluid a day, which should evaporate at such a rate that body temperature and skin moisture are at the biologically required level. But this function could be performed only by a complete covering of body hair. No artificial clothing in the world is capable of it. A coat of hair is at the same time the best clothing because it allows full freedom of movement and does not in any way restrict blood circulation. This too is an important precondition for the maintaining physical and mental. This too is an important precondition for maintaining physical and mental health. Restricted circulation is a strain on the heart and impedes the supply of blood to the body, including the brain. This is the cause of many illnesses, even if they are mainly diagnosed differently. Tight, constricting clothing reduces one's ability to think to an undreamt of degree, and gives rise to unwelcome states of mind and to irritability, impatience, and aggressiveness. Anyone wearing tight shoes is clearly aware of this. Moreover, a coat of one's own protects against scrapes and blows. It does not get worn out and renews itself. Of the hairs that have finished growing, only as many fall out as is necessary for the coat to remain sufficiently long. The length and thickness of the coat even regulate themselves according to changing climatic conditions in the course of the year. Artificial clothing tears, wears out, gets dirty, and must therefore be washed and changed. One of the most important yet least considered functions of the coat consists of the automatic cleaning of the skin and of the coat itself.
Sweat loosens dirt adhering to the skin, which then literally climbs up the individual hairs. At the ends of the hairs, it dries and falls off as dust. Any ape living in freedom will always be found to have an exceptionally clean, healthy, and odorless skin, although he never has a bath. Man, on the other hand, without artificial hygiene, is unclean and foul smelling. Sweat and dirt remain adhering to his skin and decay there. He is forced to wash often. If he does not only would he smell unpleasant, but he would suffer from a great variety of skin diseases. And, in spite of his cleanliness, he is not as clean as an ape living in liberty. Although he has been using pleasant smelling substances since time immemorial to efface or conceal his foul smelling sweat and the dirt on his skin. Artificial clothing does not clean the skin. On the contrary, sweat is mainly retained on the skin by clothing, or it sticks to the clothing where it decomposes and irritates the skin. Body hair affords visual camouflage too, by means of its color, an added safeguard against the attacks of hostile animals. This camouflage was of the greatest importance at the very time when man lost his hair, but even today he wears camouflage clothing when hunting animals or when under the influence of a periodically recurring morbid mass psychosis, engaged on planned group mass murder expeditions against his fellow men, which he calls wars. Body hair likewise protects one from the rain. The water slides outwards off the grease-covered hairs or evaporates in the warm air cushion formed by the hair. Artificial clothing can admittedly be waterproof too, but then it is also airproof and so harmful to the health. A coat of hair of one's own is thus a perfect, unsurpassable form of clothing, which contributes extensively to one's own health. Man lost his and has to replace it artificially. The substitute is, however, not only imperfect, it actually causes physical and mental damage. This loss took place very early while man was still half animal, when his intellectual capacity was still not equal to procuring substitute clothing. It happened at a stage in time when he was supposedly exiled to grasslands, where, as is well known, biting winds blow, nights are cold, and he would need camouflage from wild animals. Man has never been able to eliminate the harmful effects which artificial clothing has on his health. His first clothing still remains the best substitute. He used vegetable materials and the hides of animals and produced from these very wide, loose-fitting clothing. This restricted his movements as little as possible and provided amply for air circulation between skin and clothing, which controlled body heat and the evaporation of sweat relatively well. As a result of his increasing mental decline, man's works became, in the course of time, more important for him than himself. So in his clothing too, he stressed externals at the expense of fitness for purpose, health, and comfort, thereby causing
undreamt of physical and mental damage. Thus, the loss of his coat of body hair had only disadvantages for man, and no advantages. In the end, he was forced to replace as best he could what he had lost, because he would otherwise have become extinct. All this, however, did not prevent the scientists from representing this disease deficiency as a logical consequence of natural evolution, without pointing out even one single advantage. Some scientists even consider it possible that loss of body hair was caused by mechanisms of sexual selection. According to this theory, the ideal of beauty for male apes suddenly became a naked she-ape, and only such females were fertilized. As if that were not enough, some even maintain quite seriously that this state of affairs contributed greatly to raising intelligence, because producing clothes furthers the intelligence and means progress. According to this tailor-favoring theory, it is downright fortunate that man lost something useful to him, which he had to replace by the sweat of his brow. This appears in scientific books written by scientists and is unprotestingly read and believed by the enlightened public. A similar loss affecting any other animal, even in a much milder form, would be represented by the same scientists as aberrant and entirely incompatible with natural development. However, as this loss concerned man, they feel bound to stand the truth on its head. And what reasons do the scientists produce to account for the loss of a coat of hair? One of the theories runs thus: primitive man did not need hair on his body, either in the tropics or in the colder regions, and shed it in a natural way. Whether this was achieved by growing intelligence is not stated, but connections are implied. In any case, this is supposed to have been a step forward as far as natural evolution is concerned. Why man had to find clothing for himself from the earliest times is mentioned by no one, because one would then have to recognize that the coming of nakedness was an aberrant development and a disease that would discredit all books about evolution of mankind. At the same time, it is still maintained that man's forebears were afraid of animals, and because of this, stood up on their hind legs in the high grass to be able to see their enemies. Logically, they would have needed good camouflage for this, but they lost this at that very time. Others concern themselves less with causes and come to the following conclusion. In this state of half-man, man began to wear clothes, and this caused his own coat of hair to become superfluous, and it degenerated and disappeared. Why a half-animal, half-man suddenly puts on clothes, although he has a coat of hair, no one wants to explain at any price. His own coat had given this creature sufficient protection for 20 million years. This theory also remains artificial clothing. This theory also represents artificial clothing as a sign of progress, demonstrating things, it is true, the other way round. One minute cleverness makes you naked, the next nakedness makes you clever. But there are still other theories in circulation concerning the loss of body hair. Man lost his coat of hair through natural selection. Body hair caused wind resistance when running, as man was always having to run away from or run after wild animals. Only those who had least hair survived, since they could run faster because they encountered less wind resistance. This process of natural selection continued until all men were naked. Where they hid their hair-covered heads as they ran, the scientists do not say. Thus man was supposed to turn into a sort of streamlined racing vehicle superior to hairy animals as far as running is concerned. To be sure, this was not a success, for wolves and tigers were faster in spite of their hair, and yet he, the loser, is to be portrayed as the victor. Where natural evolution is concerned, it is not possible that the loss of hair should have anything to do with the growth of intelligence, nor can an increase in intelligence cause the loss of body hair. Man could be just as clever with a coat of hair as he is naked, perhaps even cleverer, and would certainly be healthier than he is today. The second great loss suffered during the progress of human development was the disappearance of sex signs in the female. These appear once a month in anthropoid apes and last only a few days. The male animal should expend his sexual energy only at times when fertilization is possible. Otherwise, continual strife would reign among the males of a group concerning the female apes, with an endless round of chaotic and pointless sexual activity. This would cause the ever necessary vigilance towards the hostile environment to suffer, and there would be insufficient time and strength even for the gathering of food. Any species of animal would eventually die out in such circumstances. Now, did the hominid ape, which later became man, have this important mechanism for preserving the breed's healthy, continued existence? Yes, it did. Otherwise, the species would long since have been extinct in its ape condition. For the aforesaid reasons, in some primitive tribes on islands in the Pacific Ocean who embarked on the process of human development several 100,000 years later, many women still possess degenerate traces of these sex signs, which occur still oftener as atavistic throwbacks. Man lost this extremely important physiological characteristic in the course of human development. This loss may, in the very near future, decide whether he survives or not. If the signs of fertility still existed, he would be able to prevent the overpopulation of the earth by natural birth control. This loss, too, hit human beings hard, as man's drive towards sexual activity did not lessen. He at first had intercourse indiscriminately at any time with any woman, even if she were not showing signs of sexual readiness. This was before long
the cause of an increase in sexual activity, regardless of its purpose, and of continual deadly strife among men. This period became one of the most dangerous in the history of mankind, for the species was threatened with extinction or self-annihilation. However, as man already possessed a greater capacity for thought by that time, he was able to save his breed from extinction by an ingenious stratagem. One or more women were allotted to each man for his exclusive use, and at the same time he was forbidden to associate with other women on a sexual basis. From this was born the institution of marriage, which is today just as imperfect and expedient as it was then. From the beginning, it has been completely unnatural. But, I'm sorry. From the beginning, it has been a completely unnatural, but inevitably necessary measure. The polygamous ape, which previously had been able to associate freely with all the females of his group, manifesting the signs of fertility, put a chain around his own neck. Infringement of the rule was punished harshly, often by death, and it still is in many societies. Is it possible that in the course of natural evolution, this vital physiological function should have disappeared and have had to be meagerly replaced by an artificial arrangement to avoid the extinction of the species? No! Nor can this have anything to do with the natural development. Now, is this loss of such an important attribute of the sexual life a prerequisite for the acquisition of higher intelligence? Or does higher intelligence cause the loss of such an important physiological attribute? The acquisition of higher intelligence in the course of natural evolution cannot be connected with the loss of meaningful physical characteristics. Nor can the loss of an important physiological attribute be the precondition for an increase in intelligence. Thus, this loss too has nothing to do with natural development, higher intelligence, and progress. More, it is unnatural and damaging. All this, however, does not prevent the scientists from once again representing this defect. Though it took coercion to put it right as a product of natural development and the expedient of marriage as a sign of high intelligence, science simply refuses to recognize that man even today accepts these rules only with reluctance in spite of their needfulness, and therefore draws no conclusions from this. Man is consistently in rebellion against these self-imposed rules. He changes wives and maintains brothels. If the rules circumscribing him were the consequence of natural development and increased intelligence, and man rebelled against them, then he would be rebelling against his own development and his own intelligence. However, no creature on earth is in opposition to its own natural development or the consequences of it. So, if man did establish something against which he periodically rebels, this
happened not because he was more intelligent, but because he was forced into it by necessity, brought about by an unnatural cause. Man's sexual life is transparently in a mess. Far from indicating natural development, this can only indicate unnatural development, the consequences of which man has not yet grasped, even today. Indeed, he has not the remotest idea of them. The third phenomenon is the immense and rapid growth of the brain and still greater increase of the intelligence. Basically, each creature is provided only with such attributes and abilities as are necessary, for the prevention of self and breed. This is true of physical attributes such as much as of. This is true of physical attributes just as much as of mental abilities. One more time. Basically, each creature is provided only with such attributes and abilities as are necessary for preservation of self and breed. This is true of physical attributes just as much as of mental abilities. If a breed does not fulfill these basic conditions, it becomes extinct. Man's forebears, like their nearest relations, other hominid types, began by fulfilling these basic conditions for a healthy life. They had more or less the same skull capacity and possessed equal intelligence. They lived at the same time in the same geographical territories in the same climatic conditions. They ate the same food, fruit, plants, and roots. They were almost indistinguishable from in their way of life. They even had the same enemies. Then what did the animal that later became man need higher intelligence for? Was this increase in intelligence necessary for the preservation of the species? Would they have died out if their intelligence had not increased? Did nature make special new demands of them which only a higher intelligence could meet? Nature, as has been said, did not make any such new demands of them. Had it been so, then all other hominid apes would have been similarly affected, and their intelligence too would have risen accordingly. But they underwent no such phenomenal increase in intelligence, and in spite of that, they did not become extinct. Instead, they are still living today in better health and with fewer worries than man. Man, however, in the last million years acquired an excess of intellectual ability, which he does not need to keep himself alive. Not only this, he finds it a source of ever new and ever greater worries and problems, which, up until now, he has been unable to overcome. On the contrary, he makes problems for himself that are more and more numerous and more difficult in solving, which he conjures up even more complicated problems. In solving which he conjures up even more complicated problems. He cannot escape this fiendish spiral. Strangely enough, this increase in intelligence began at the same time he lost the other two vital attributes. his coat of hair, and the female sex signs. The laws of natural evolution teach not only that no creature loses useful attributes, but also that none acquires abilities not needed in fulfilling the essential conditions of life. The exceptional increase in brain size and intelligence shows clearly, however, that a surplus was created in this case. So, natural development cannot result in a surplus of intelligence. If such a surplus occurred and further abnormal physical defects appeared into the bargain, this could only happen as a result of artificial intervention. There are already 3 indications to be considered which suggest something other than natural evolution. The loss of a coat of body hair, the loss of the sex signs, and the surplus of intelligence. Deficiency and excess are diseased conditions. No creature on Earth would be able to sustain 2 such serious physical losses, one of which alone would be sufficient to destroy the species, unless some artificial measures were used to counteract them. The selfsame creature, however, possesses a surplus of brain and intelligence, which makes it possible for him to correct, in a makeshift sort of way, the 2 diseased deficiencies. Only one such being exists on Earth, and that is man. He is the youngest living creature, and since he acquired his new consciousness, he has asked in fear, confusion, and doubt the questions: where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? These questions were and are fully justified. For man feels that, in his case, the balance between mind and body has been lost. He sought and still seeks today the truth concerning himself, and he searches for what he has lost, although he does not know what it is and why he has lost it. If one works on these assumptions, all illusions concerning man, his origins, and the goals he has followed hitherto disappear. His imaginatively constructed castle in the air has collapsed. The ground is being cut away beneath the feet of the affirmations which have always been believed. For man came into being not in harmony with the principles of this universe, but in acting against its order and making himself. He became physically and mentally sick. He is swimming in a raging ocean of uncertainty, the billows of which he himself has caused. He is swimming in a raging ocean of uncertainty, the billows of which he himself has caused to rage. The lifeboats which he is forever constructing in the name of progress are puny straws to which he tightly clings, but they are not able to carry him, and one day not even a straw will be left. There will be no lifeboat for him. Chapter 3: The Empty Skulls. One ape discovered that Eating the fresh brain of one's own kind increases the sexual impulses. He and his descendants became addicted to the brains and hunted for them. It was not until later that they noticed that their intelligence increased as a result. The outcome of this process is Homo sapiens. The description central nervous system is used to describe the brain itself and the network of nerves which is attached to the brain. The brain performs many functions and does not serve exclusively for thinking. Man knows very little about the functioning of the brain. He knows the various parts which perform different functions. He knows that the brain controls not only conscious voluntary actions, but also unconscious automatic ones, like digestion, growth, gland secretions, blood formation, and everything required to maintain life. These functions are so stratified that it will still be a long time before man is able to explain them, even approximately. Even the origin of a thought and memory itself are and remain unexplored phenomena. To understand the process of thought by what is itself a thought process is just as impossible as to lift oneself up in the air. But it is certain that chemical substances react upon one another in the brain in a way which is inexplicable. This gives rise to impulses and orders which are intended to regulate living functions harmoniously. What these impulses and orders are, we cannot say. Their origin and how they take effect are unknown to us. All the physical and intellectual functions of every animal are harmoniously guided by the brain so that neither deficiency nor excess occurs in the organs. As at the beginning of human development, highly dangerous deficiencies occurred in man's hair growth and his sexual life, while there were unjustified surpluses in his brain and intelligence. The question must be asked, as at the beginning of human development, highly dangerous deficiencies occurred in man's hair growth and his sexual life, while there were unjustified surpluses in his brain and intelligence. The question must be asked, are hair growth, sexual life, and intelligence controlled by the brain? Intelligence, capacity for thought, and memory are located in certain parts of the brain. Hair growth, sexual reactions, like many other physiological functions, are controlled by one of the most important glands of the brain, the pituitary gland, or hypothalamus. I'm sorry, hypophysis, not hypothesis, hypophysis, 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 hypophysis. another word for the pituitary gland hypophysis. This gland, which is about the size of a nut, is situated at the level of the nose in the lower part of the brain. The development in man of the above-mentioned singular and abnormal phenomena could only have occurred through disturbance of the controlling machinery, the brain, in its previous function. Is it possible that man, while still an animal, consciously interfered with his brain, thus disturbing its orderly functioning? If any such artificial intervention could be proved, then this would explain all the anomalous phenomena, indicating something other than natural development, which are unique in nature. Indeed, the animal which later became man did consciously interfere with his own brain. Man is the only creature on earth to have killed his own kind in order to eat their brains. Man's forebears began doing so more than 1 million years ago and carried on without interruption through the whole process of human development. They ceased doing so generally only about 50,000 years ago. What caused the ape ancestors of man to do this? And why did they continue the practice once they had become men? Man's ape ancestors discovered that the consumption of the brains of their fellows increased their sexuality. They became addicted to brains and hunted for them. It was not until later that they noticed that their intelligence increased in the process. The desire for increased sexual pleasure and the later desire to become more intelligent induced man to pursue cannibalism more intensively. The process of human development began with the consumption of a brain, and this continued uninterrupted through the whole story of mankind's development. In eating the brain, man consumed the substances concentrated in it. Both his brain and his capacity for thought increased disproportionately. From this arose the biologically unjustified surplus of intelligence, which later turned into a diseased condition. At the same time, the functions of the central nervous system, originally in equilibrium, were disturbed by the same means. The pituitary gland being particularly affected, this controls, among other things, hair growth and sexuality. Because of the constant new supply of brain substances, the distribution of hormones and other secretions was thrown into confusion. A new distribution system had to be developed. This became the cause of physical defects, such as the loss of a coat of hair and of the female signs of fertility. The result is a physically and mentally ill creature at odds with himself and with nature, who neither knows nor understands himself. The huge discrepancy between his almost unaltered form and his enormously increased intelligence forces man into further abnormal and self-destructive acts. He himself names this unhealthy process progress. The big brain, which is his pride, is an artificially created, oversized, diseased gland. Hallucinations are imprinted on his knowledge. Since cannibalism began, His mind has become more and more confused. It is drawing inexorably nearer to the extremely dangerous state in which man will destroy himself by mentally running amok, a lunatic of genius. Thus, Homo sapiens tries to explain his unique diseased condition and its origin by every conceivable means and with every conceivable theory as being the outcome of a natural development willed by God and within the frame of cosmic order. This recognition is deeply shocking to human beings, but they must draw the conclusions to be drawn. That is, man must rediscover and recognize the truth hitherto considered impossible and dismissed by science as a superstition. Intelligence can be eaten. Memory can be eaten. Even concrete knowledge can be eaten. Man came into being through cannibalism. Science did not dare carry out research into cannibalism because the subconscious inherited feelings of guilt existing in all men concerning cannibalism held it in check. Science did not dare carry out research into cannibalism because the subconscious inherited feelings of guilt existing in all men concerning cannibalism held it in check. When European seafarers in search of gold and riches discovered strange continents about 500 years ago, they came across men who looked different from themselves. They found among almost all races, especially in the southern hemisphere of the world, a cruel custom. Men hunted men, mainly in order to eat their heads. This custom was named cannibalism. When the intruders colonized these territories, they forbade cannibalism and explained it away as a senseless, superstitious rite without investigating its causes and motives. But cannibalism continued to be practiced secretly in spite of being forbidden and in spite of stiff penalties, and it is still practiced today in some areas of Southeast Asia, Central Africa, South America, and on the islands of the Pacific Ocean. With this ban, the matter seemed settled in the minds of those acting unasked in the role of a world police force. When extensive investigation into man's origin began about 150 years ago, remains of human skeletons were found dating further and further back and bearing strange marks. Oddly enough, where finds were more than 50,000 years old, generally only skulls or remains of skulls were found, without the skeleton to which they belonged. It was striking, too, that in the majority of cases where a skeleton was found with the skull was separated from the skeleton. Almost all the skulls that were found were broken open at nose level. Often, it could even be established that the contents of the skull had been scraped out with sharp objects because scrape marks were still recognizable on the inner surfaces in spite of the skull's great age. And this was the case
even when the skeleton lying nearby was not dismembered. This indicates that the bodies themselves were not eaten, and that cannibals, as a rule, ate only the brains. As the finds unequivocally indicate, the hollowed out skulls, apart from being opened by artificial means, were not further destroyed. With finds of yet older skulls, undoubtedly belonging to the earliest and most primitive half-men, still more remarkable facts came to light. In the absence of suitable tools, the skulls were not broken open at nose level and scooped out, but broken into pieces like a nut. Proof that cannibals did not use an empty skull for some purpose or other, but wanted to get at the brain. Higher intelligence and better tools did not make expert opening of the skull possible until later. And this, strangely enough, was effected from in front at nose level or from underneath. Although it would have been easier to open the top of the skull or the back of the head. The most important gland of the brain, the pituitary gland, is of course situated immediately behind the nose. Neither the earliest half-men nor later men, however, hunted and ate any skulls other than those of their fellow men. It was especially striking that in the many caves in which man's forebears lived, more skull remains were found than remains of other parts of human skeleton. The corpse of a captive was dragged into the dwelling only if circumstances permitted. Only in cases such as these was the body eaten too. And then the marrow, the bone marrow, was obviously especially prized, for the bones were generally broken to pieces. However, everyone carrying out investigations will confirm the already known fact that most human skulls found up to the present time, and dating back more than 50,000 years, were the object of cannibalism. Skulls dating back 300,000 years and more were all the object of cannibalism, with the exception of those where it could be established beyond doubt that death was the result of a landslide or of drowning, so that the corpse could be reached by no one. What has been found shows too that human skulls from every age group and both sexes were the object of cannibalism. There were indications that even the brain of those who had died by natural means was eaten, right down to members of the same family in many areas. For example, in the case of Sinanthropus, the forebears of the Chinese, the results of excavations up to now show unequivocally that cannibalism started at the same time as the process of human development, no earlier and no later. It can be proved, too, that in every inhabited region, all the human races, without exception, and their ape-like forebears before them, were cannibals. This is not a new discovery. On the contrary, it is well known even to those scientists who desperately try to explain the natural evolution of man. Certainly, from about 40 to 50,000 years ago, cannibalism declined sharply. Finds show, however,
that cannibalism was practiced on the Eurasian continent up until 4,000 years ago, albeit with increasing rarity. Isolated cases of cannibalism can be proved to have occurred in Western Europe up to AD 1800 and in the Balkans, even in the last century, definitely not caused by hunger. In Malaya, North Thailand, Borneo, Indonesia, the Philippines, New Guinea, and Central Africa, and among the South American Indians, cannibalism is still secretly practiced today. Wherever the aboriginals of other civilizations live in isolation, as they do in some parts of New Guinea and in the forests of South America, cannibalism is practiced freely and openly. Those taking part in expeditions which happen to intrude have taken from them not their valuables, but their heads, while the bodies of the dead are generally thrown away. Science holds various opinions concerning cannibalism, but they all have one thing in common. They are just as untenable as the hitherto accepted theories about the origin of man. Most theories willfully gloss over cannibalism. Why? Because in man's subconscious, cannibalism created a feeling of guilt which has been transmitted through heredity to all man's descendants. Therefore, he instinctively runs away from this phenomenon, oppressed by subconscious guilt, and refuses under any circumstances to see a connection between his development into man and cannibalism. The few who do scholars thus expound the hypothesis that all animals on the earth were clever enough to follow their usual diet at times of distress, with the sole exception of the cleverest, man. They speak of recurring, more continuous periods of hunger throughout the world, and suppose that our vegetarian forefathers could find no plants, no fruit, not even any animals, only their own fellow men, which they were forced to kill and eat because of hunger. Why were the other vegetarian apes and other herbivorous animals not affected by such famines? And why did they not eat each other up? Why did zebra not eat zebra and elephant not eat elephant? Were they perhaps able to retreat to a place where there were still fruit and plants? Why did our forebears not travel there too? Were they not clever enough? And did the famine perhaps last 1,000,000 years? And did that give rise to the unbroken chain of skulls evidencing cannibalism? In the inhabited caves of prehistory, a great number of bones were found belonging to various animals, from rats to bears, while among them human remains. Preponderantly, remains of skulls make up at most 2%. This 2% cannot have been the motive for people the whole world over to eat each other so as not to starve. Such theories are, moreover, incapable of explaining why, for example, in Borneo and New Guinea, even today, amid a luxuriant landscape abounding in food and game, men hunt men. Still less can they explain why both a million years ago and now the supposedly hungry cannibals generally left and leave the flesh of the body untouched and ate and eat mainly the brain. At the same time, a highly schemed at the same time, a highly esteemed group of scholars regards cannibalism as the superstitious and reasonless rite of a primitive religious belief. And they established this without ever having discussed the matter with a cannibal. As all human races, without exception, in all areas and at all periods, were cannibals, then it should follow that for many hundreds of thousands of years, all mankind had a uniform religion which rested on a senseless superstition. In other words, what Lao Tzu, Buddha, Christ, Muhammad, and all other founders of religions have failed to do, namely, give mankind a universal religion, an ape managed to do a million years ago. And this senseless superstition, bound up with so much murder and suffering and with the danger of being eaten oneself, must presumably have been so good and attractive that it flourished for more than a million years and, in many areas, is still followed today. Such a theory of religion can be born only in the heads of idiotic specialists who have failed to notice that the various races in Borneo, the Philippines, New Guinea, and South America who are still cannibals today subscribe to different religions, but nonetheless practice cannibalism in the same way as all human races did in the past. Should one then take it that thousands of different religions certainly existed, but all with one thing in common: the unremitting, senseless, purposeless murder of one's fellow men, which ended by eating their brains? Such theoreticians, without ever having eaten the raw brain of a man or ape, also affirm that brain is an exquisite delicacy which enticed man into indulging in his liking for good food. Raw brain, however, is devoid of flavor and has the consistency of rubber, and no breed of vegetarian ape or man in the world could consider it a delicacy. As cannibalism began while man was still an ape, when his ape forefathers, like all their closest relatives, had a skull capacity of only about 400 cubic centimeters, one can justifiably ask, how can an ape invent a religion which is bound up with the ritual murder of his fellows and the eating, supposedly to no effect, of their brains? And how can this senseless belief, with its superstitious ritual, still hold good for men once they have become intelligent and survive for more than a million years? Although present-day cannibals have the wildest assortment of religions. If human beings murdered their fellow humans and ate their brains over such a long period of time, then they must have perceived some advantages in it. Otherwise, they were from the very beginning the stupidest creatures on earth. If cannibalism had not been practiced until an advanced stage of man's development, when man already had a bigger brain, one could take it that he was acting under the influence of some hallucination. But cannibalism began when man was still an animal. It cannot be a senseless act, because an animal does nothing unless he derives some benefit from it. So the hunger and right theories of the scholars can be regarded as absurd with every justification. What then was the real reason causing a vegetarian ape to eat the brains of his own kind and to continue this strange practice over a period of more than 1,000,000 years, up to our own times? Sex. When an animal eats the fresh brain of his own kind, its sexual impulses increase. It will lead a more active sex life and experience more sensations of pleasure. There was no need to be clever or to subscribe to any belief or superstition to realize this. All that was necessary was to eat the fresh brain of one's own kind once, by chance or by necessity, in order to detect the effect mentioned. The first man was that ape which for the first time ate the fresh brain of one of his fellows. The first human beings had become cannibals through hunger for sex. Cannibalism and human development started at the same time. Cannibalism is the cause of human development. The first cannibal apes could not know at the start that eating brain not only stimulated them sexually, but increased their intellectual capacities as well. It was not until later that they discovered the effect on their intelligence. Most unfortunately, they discovered also that eating brain caused the intelligence to grow permanently, and that this lasting effect then became hereditary. Furthermore, they discovered that it was more effective to eat the brains of those of their species who had themselves already acquired additional intelligence in the same way. So the brains of the cannibals themselves became an ever more highly prized substance for making one clever. Brains became more valuable from generation to generation. Therefore, cannibalism later came to be practiced only among the cannibals themselves. Anthropoids, which were not cannibals, were left in peace as objects of no worth and remained apes. After eating raw brain, there was an immediate effect on the sexuality, but this quickly wore off. These short-lived sexual impulses caused man consistently to renew his warring expeditions against his fellow men in order to satisfy his greed for sex through eating brain. And this simultaneously led to a lasting growth in intelligence. The pituitary gland, which maintains the physiological equilibrium, was compelled by this forced overfeeding with brain substances to form in the body a new distribution system, which is not natural. The visible consequences were first and foremost the loss of a coat of hair and the disappearance of the signs of fertility in the female sex. Because of the absence of the female sex signs, the birth rate declined. Cannibalism itself decimated the population. The species was thus in danger of extinction. To protect it from this, sexual intercourse had to be intensified so that of several attempts at fertilizing, one at least might be successful. As far as cannibalism was concerned, this meant that oil was poured on burning flames. The necessary sexual prowess could be attained only by increased consumption of the sex drug, brain. The hunt for men was therefore pursued more zealously than ever before. Men reciprocally decimated each other because they wanted to accelerate their increase. And paradoxically, the increase in births achieved as a consequence of eating brain was largely eliminated again by cannibalism itself. The species was able to increase in numbers only slowly because of this. Indeed, many a time population numbers went down. One must not forget that female anthropoid apes can generally bring only 3, at most 6, depending on breed, young into the world. And to begin with, this was true of humans too. With this small growth in population and cannibalism too, it is understandable that the species was constantly exposed to the danger of self-annihilation. The insufficient number of young produced by the females led to depression of spirit, which they tried to set right by the women urging the men to carry out cannibal raids and enjoy meals consisting of brain. Later on, the women were always present at the ritual dances which took place before such manhunts, and they encouraged their men. This still happens today where cannibalism is practiced. They even refuse to marry men who have not yet eaten human brain, because they fear that such a man cannot produce a large family of children. Since, however, the brain grew and intelligence increased also as a result of cannibalism, cannibalism gained an important new motive. It was no longer practiced for sexual reasons alone, but also in order to increase intelligence. As this happened, the motive of fertility still remained very much to the fore. Critics will ask, is an ape sufficiently intelligent to wish for increased sexuality and to take action to repeat the arousal of such feelings? In Nepal, Kashmir, and Afghanistan, there is a plant growing on the slopes of the Himalayas which is called salajin or salajin by the indigenous people. Before the area extending between Persia and Egypt became arid, this plant flourished on the coast of the Mediterranean too. It is gathered annually and sold throughout India and as far away as Persia and Afghanistan, mainly by itinerant Nepalese merchants. This sexually stimulating drug is often mixed in honey with medicinal herbs and minerals and then consumed. However, its effect both on the sex life and the memory is short lived, and it has to be taken again and again. As soon as the plant is ripe, it is gathered immediately, for man has lively competition from apes. They too eat the sex drug. This shows that apes are aware of sex and sufficiently intelligent to register the effect of this plant and to induce it consciously. But this drug has not yet turned any breed of ape into more intelligent creatures because, as said, the effect of this plant on the sex life and on the understanding too is only transient, nor is it hereditary. What do cannibals themselves say about cannibalism? As it is forbidden almost everywhere today and practiced only in secret, it is exceptionally difficult to collect authentic information concerning it. The main reason for silence is not, however, the prohibition. From the very beginning, man has regarded this act as sinful. He was killing completely innocent fellow men, generally unknown to him, solely in order to satisfy his sexual urge. On account of this crime, an inherited subconscious sense of guilt has made him feel ever since that the sexual act itself is sinful. Cannibalism was always carried out on a communal basis and in connection with a ritual, so as to make the murder appear an almost permitted joint enterprise. The sense of guilt is the most important reason for the reticence of cannibals. In spite of these difficulties, I was able to speak with several people who were either cannibals themselves or immediate descendants of cannibals. The latter, whose knowledge of cannibalism came from their fathers, are less cautious and speak more freely. On the islands between Java and New Guinea, where cannibalism was forbidden only about 80 years ago and was nonetheless continued secretly, it was not carried out by means of warring expeditions. The old men were killed shortly before their death from natural causes was to be expected, with the concurrence of their sons. The killing took place in the evening, in the course of a special gathering, without the victim knowing what was in store for him. He was stabbed from behind by a friend of his son. Then the corpse was immediately dismembered, lightly cooked and eaten. The head was never cooked and belonged to the healthy young friends of the man's sons, who ate the raw brain. Heart and liver were the next most sought-after organs, and they too were eaten, only by the men. The chest and stomach muscles belonged to the women. The children were given the hands and feet to make them more nimble. The rest of the body was burnt. This all took place in a strict ritualistic ceremony. The guardian spirits of the house and the village were invited by prayer so as to keep the evil spirits away. Religious dances were also performed. Special rules were observed. Only physically perfect, mentally sound, intelligent men were the object of cannibalism. The victim had to have eaten his fill before being killed, and was supposed also to have drunk a fermented alcoholic drink. The killing was done with a bamboo dagger, less often with an iron dagger, but the brain itself might never come in contact with a metal object. It had to be taken out with a bamboo spoon and eaten while fresh and still warm. Cannibalism might take place only when the moon was increasing, best of all shortly before full moon. Cannibals affirm that when the moon waxes, all one's strength travels up to the head, and that the brain is then more powerful in its effect and furthering the in its effect of furthering the understanding. In this respect, the same principles applied as used to be taken into consideration in farming. Farmers still know today that a crop sown when the moon is waxing will grow better. That a tree should be grafted when the moon is waxing, but not lopped, because its invisible life force, drawn by the moon, slowly disappears through the wounds made by cutting. Metal objects, especially iron, may not touch the brain, indeed may not even come near it, because metals send out rays which have a disturbing effect on everything organic. The cannibals affirm that these rays diminish the brain's power to further intelligence and its other properties. When cannibalism began, man was not familiar with any metals. He used stones, wood, and his teeth to kill and to plunder the skulls. When many hundreds of thousands of years later he discovered metals and used the metal objects in hunting and killing, he noticed that they upset the effect of the brain when it was eaten and went back to stone and wooden tools. Present-day cannibals almost all possess metal weapons and metal tools, but they do not use them when they are preparing and eating the head. They stress, too, that the brain must be eaten while still quick, before the secret power has escaped from it. To the question why the brain of an old man was eaten at all, there comes always the same reply. The old men were clever. They had this cleverness in them because they themselves had eaten the brains of many clever men and had gathered much experience in the course of their long lives. They knew which tree should be felled, at what time, and in what way, so that a good house could be built from it. They even knew which wood was to be placed upright and which crossways, so that evil spirits and disease could not penetrate the house. They knew, moreover, how to make friendly contact with good spirits and obtain their favor for their family and kindred. They also knew, so it is said, how the evil spirits and the bad air sent by the evil spirits carrying disease could be warded off. They knew many medicines and prayers which healed disease. They were able to transmit their strength and their health to the weak and the ill. They knew how to look into the hearts of men and recognize good and evil in them. Hence, they were also good judges. They saw into the future and knew what dangers were in store for their people and were able to warn the village in time. They also possessed the ability to speak with gods. Anyone who had eaten the brain of such a man not only became clever, but acquired as well the secret knowledge of the man who had been killed. He even knew all that the old man had already forgotten, For as soon as this knowledge passed into the brain of a younger man, the forgotten knowledge was restored to life. He also became healthier, was able to maintain a large and healthy family, and lived longer. Happy was the young man who had many good friends, and so had more frequent opportunities of eating the brains of their old fathers. For the oftener one had eaten brain, and the more one had eaten of it, the greater one's knowledge became. Only the men were supposed to eat brain, because it would be a pity to give it to a woman who could not in any case become as clever as a man. She might even become ill or mad from eating it. A cannibal told me on a small island near Timor. Among his tribe, cannibalism was perpetrated only on old men shortly before their natural death. These natives are gentle, friendly, peaceful people with a high and ancient culture. Among, for example, the Bataks of Sumatra, the Dayaks of Borneo, and many tribes on New Guinea, where it is not the old men who are eaten, but where the strong, healthy warriors capture and kill their victims on occasional manhunts. Another motive became prominent: the sexual vitality of the man. A man who, thanks to his skill and courage, is frequently able to eat brain becomes clever, strong, skillful, brave, and very active sexually. He will be able to beget many healthy, clever children. Only young men take part in such manhunts, either married men or boys who have reached puberty. They were declared in a dedication ceremony to have attained full manhood. Old men, incapable of begetting children, are excluded from brain banquets. A young man who is unmarried, but who has been initiated, and who has managed through his own prowess to eat human brain one or even several times, is highly respected and is entitled to betrothal with the best of the girls. One day he will sit in the council of warriors, or may even become chief. As is logical, his stock is high among the women, and they encourage the men to take part in hunting and eating human beings. These cannibals also affirm that not only the intelligence and physical well-being of the victim are transferred, but his boldness and courage as well. Therefore, if the victim is a brave warrior or even a chief, the operation will be all the more successful. Prior to these raids, long, complicated preparations take place. The men induce a state of aggression psychosis in themselves by rhythmic dancing and alcoholic drinks. The women stand around the men in a circle, kindling them by clapping their hands rhythmically and moving and calling out in an encouraging and erotic manner.
The preparation ceremony used to be the intentionally noisy. The preparation ceremony used to be intentionally noisy and was often advertised by the beating of drums. After this declaration of war, the enemy had likewise to make their preparations and raise their courage by dancing and fermented drinks. For so it is said, if a man musters up great courage and boldness in this way, and is eaten in such a state, then his courage and boldness are transferred to whoever eats him. This, and not politeness, is the sole reason for announcing an intended attack. Manhunts were undertaken only when the moon was in a favorable position. If members of an enemy tribe were captured other than in the course of a raid, they were kept alive until shortly before full moon. They were fed well, and shortly before their death, they were stimulated in the same way by fermented drinks. The brain might not come into contact with or even be near metals in this case either. The brain was eaten by several men at a time. They partook of this repast in a strictly prescribed order of precedence. It was even laid down who should eat which part of the brain, for different parts have different virtues and effects. The distribution at any given time followed the order of gallantry. Who had given the first, second, and third lance thrusts, for example? This complicated ritual rests on the experience of thousands of years. The first warrior was allowed to eat the most potent part of the brain, including the pituitary gland. And that was why the area behind the nose was scooped out first. The others received the less valuable parts. All this does not happen only somewhere in the primeval forest among savages. However, nor does it belong to a far distant past. Even today, there are still people taking part in cannibal feasts who were educated in Christian missionary schools and who dress like Europeans. From time to time, one reads in the newspaper that primitive tribes are, of their own accord, taking part in the fighting when there is political unrest. If those fighting on behalf of a regime which is politically to the left eat their opponents, then the Western newspapers say that communists are eating people. But if cannibals in Borneo, supporting a so-called democratic regime, eat some Chinese, they say that gallant anti-communists have given expression to their justified anger and their patriotic feelings. Truth to tell, these cannibals are not in the least interested in politics, but they make full use of the opportunity to eat men without fear of punishment, for the same reasons as men have eaten men for over 1,000,000 years.
to increase their sexual vitality and their intelligence. Cannibalism still exists in a special form in Southeast Asia and in China today. The old threat to an enemy, "I will eat your heart," is not idle talk. From ancient times, the belief has existed in those parts, as it did in Europe too, that eating the human heart brought physical benefits and mental ones too. And on occasion, even today, the heart of an adversary killed in battle is eaten in some parts of East Asia. In the Second World War, when Chinese troops were driving the Japanese out of China, Chinese soldiers and officers would from time to time eat the hearts of Japanese soldiers who had been killed. If circumstances permitted, the fresh heart would be cut in cubes and lightly cooked in boiling water, then eaten immediately. Those eating it wanted in so doing to acquire qualities such as steadfastness and loyalty, better capacity for thought and intelligence. People who had taken part in such repasts of heart, officers and educated people among them, assured me that they had been aware of the effects mentioned. And a mildly and permitted form of cannibalism still exists today in Africa, Southeast Asia, South China, Taiwan, and on some neighboring islands. The eating of fresh ape brain. In Asia, this still occurs even in public restaurants. When brain is eaten in this way, the same procedures are followed among cannibals who eat human brain. Here too, the brain is eaten only when the moon is increasing, if possible shortly before full moon, because it works best then. The ape may likewise not come near metal objects, because the rays emitted by metals have a prejudicial influence on the nervous system and the brain. It is therefore kept in a wooden cage. Shortly before it is killed, it is offered a sip of an alcoholic drink and a handful of nuts to chew to stimulate its brain. The skull is broken with a stone or a wooden hammer, under no circumstances with anything made of metal. The brain is immediately scooped out with a china or bamboo spoon and eaten as it is. The brain is tough and rubbery and can hardly be chewed. It is devoid of flavor, yet on account of the blood, rather sweet. Not a delicacy by any standard. Those eating it themselves drink alcoholic drinks with it. Only men partake of such repasts of ape brain. In these cases too, it is always stressed that the effect whereby intelligence is increased is permanent. The ape's body is thrown away. Meat, however, are cooked and given to the children because, according to tradition, they increase skill and strengthen the lungs. Scholars will brush this aside, too, as a superstitious, nonsensical ritual, or as something eaten in times of famine, just as true cannibalism, too, was supposedly nothing more than that for the million years, and before that, it prevailed among all human beings. According to my own experience, about 20 hours after such a repast, there is a feeling of warmth in the brain, like a gentle pressure. After about 28 hours, the body is flooded with vitality, with increased sexual impulses. The milder forms of cannibalism described above are a residue of true cannibalism, as a consequence of which A normal ape turned into an intelligent freak, which today calls itself Homo sapiens. Now, if cannibalism increases intelligence, sexual activity, and fertility, then the question is raised: why did man give up cannibalism? Eating brain made his brain expand at such a fast rate that the skull was unable to keep up with this growth. The oversized brain was gradually subjected to increasing pressure, which in the course of time became more and more dangerous. There were ever more numerous cases of a brain disease similar to epilepsy and of extreme madness. And with no room for doubt, man was able to trace these back to the pressure on his over large brain. He recognized that this was a consequence of cannibalism, and for this reason saw himself compelled to give up eating brain. This happened about 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. Various attempts were first made at this time to ease the pressure of the skull, mostly by altering its shape. And if that did not help, then by making an opening or perforation in the skull. But these attempts were only partially successful, and cannibalism, which had been intensively practiced, went into total decline on the Eurasian continent, and later in other regions too. After that time, it was practiced only sporadically and seldom. Society condemned cannibalism first and foremost because it was responsible, in particular, for the spread of mental illnesses similar to epilepsy. The flood, which occurred about 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, also contributed to the end of cannibalism in Eurasia. Astronomers, philosophers, and prophets in the region of Mesopotamia and India, too, had foretold the flood. As they were also opposed to cannibalism, yet lacked the means to root it out once and for all, they represented the flood they announced as God's punishment for murdering man, i.e., for cannibalism. Many people in the areas affected survived the flood and were convinced that God had punished them for the murder of their fellow men, as their prophets affirmed. This is attested by the legends of various peoples, such as the Jewish traditions, for example, which were later incorporated into Christians' Bible. Their God represented having created men because their God repented having created men because they were continually becoming more wicked. Therefore, he intended to destroy them by means of a flood, but took pity on them. Noah himself, a prophet and a spiritual leader of his people, thanked God that he and many others had survived the flood. At that time, God made a covenant with mankind and gave new directions to men. Among other things, he said, "Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed." This new commandment was at the time necessary and justified, for collective murder with cannibalism as its motive was carried out just as much as a matter of course, just as commonly and with the same impunity as collective murder for the sake of oil wells or certain spheres of influence remains unpunished today. By this law, the killing of men and cannibalism with it was made punishable. This happened about 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, when the capacity of the human skull had already grown from its original size of 400 cubic centimeters to its present size of roughly 1,400 cubic centimeters. The brain, the human brain this is shown irrefutably by the results of measurements, not grown any more in the last 50,000 years. What is science's attitude concerning the problem of why cannibalism ceased? It is stated that man attained greater moral maturity and a greater sense of responsibility and therefore discontinued cannibalism. A theory which says nothing than that cannibalism is a precondition for man's moral maturity. Moreover, it says, in effect, hominid apes and all other animals reached this moral maturity without cannibalism. One must applaud the ingenuity of scientists. For the rest, since the end of cannibalism, man supposedly became more virtuous, has caused the death of substantially more human beings in his wars than he killed in the whole course of the history of mankind, motivated by cannibalism. In the course of the last 4,000 years alone, more than 3,000 million people were killed in wars waged for the sake of economy, religion, and often merely prestige, the exact equivalent of the whole population of the world at the present time. None of these wars produced any lasting effects, and therefore, in many cases, they were condemned by the next generation as senseless murder. If man were still able to be a cannibal today, without damage to himself, he would do so in spite of his supposedly higher moral sense, because the effect would be permanent. Man began his upward climb as a sex-obsessed ape, and he is still prepared today to do anything for sex and knowledge. No price is too high for him. He has got sexuality and intelligence into an irremediable mess, and is continuing to tinker with both, because he is satisfied neither with his sex life nor with his sick brain. His brain drugs and his sex drugs are of no avail in overcoming his troubles. He will never be rid of them. Why was cannibalism not abandoned until later in the southern hemisphere of the world, and then not completely? For the inhabitants of these regions, it is still rewarding today, and does not cause any such critical brain damage as it does among those races which had begun the habit about 200,000 years earlier. Cannibalism, with it, the process of human development, began in the region of Mesopotamia and spread quickly and easily on the Eurasian continent in an east-west direction, because the climatic conditions stayed almost the same. It spread south slowly and much later, because in doing so it had to overcome climatic barrier and the sea. This barrier also prevented migration and mixing of races and the spread of cultural development. It was not until 200,000 years later that cannibalism reached the southern islands of the Pacific Ocean from Mesopotamia. This means that in the islands around Australia, especially in New Guinea, the process of human development did not begin until that much later. This circumstance explains the occurrence there of many features which are no longer to be found in other parts of the earth. There one can frequently find among women remains of the signs indicating the period of fertility. There are races living there which can count up to only 3 or 5 because their brains are only 900 cubic centimeters to 1100 cubic centimeters in size. And the birth rate is lowest there because these people are still less removed from the ape condition. The period during which fecundity was low has not yet been overcome there. And that is also the main reason for the continuance of cannibalism. As, however, cannibalism was forbidden by the colonial powers, these races which came late to it are condemned to extinction, unless they interbreed with other races which are more prolific already. These people are cannibals from conviction, because they know from their own experience that eating brain raises fertility, and that not only do they become cleverer through it, but real knowledge and even the boldness or aggressiveness of the men who has been eaten can be transmitted as well. It is not therefore to be wondered at if they continue to practice cannibalism in spite of Christian baptism and in spite of threats of punishment. They listen to the explanations which many of them hear in missionary schools, according to which cannibalism is a meaningless ritual superstition, just as unbelievingly as they would if someone were to explain to them that brandy does not make you drunk. Among the consequences of cannibalism, it is not the physical defects which are the greatest evil, but the mental damage which results from over-cultivated brain. Anxieties and inferiority complexes torment man, but in addition, absurd ideas which cause him to struggle against imaginary future dangers and self-created worries. These, however, become more and more numerous and pressing precisely because of the countermeasures taken. From such measures, the curse of work arose, which weighs on no living creature other than man and man alone. It is at the root of the process which man calls progress. His physical attributes and his real physical needs too remained basically the same as 1,000,000 years ago. He needs no more food than he used to, but today he works 1,000 times more for it in order to satisfy illusory needs. Chapter 4: The Great Changes. The great changes which took place during the process of human development are symptoms of disease and the results of cannibalism. Man was forced to take emergency measures against these symptoms, but they cured the ill in only a makeshift kind of way and constantly brought about new trouble. This process whereby body and mind became sick is not yet concluded. To be continued in part 2.